Now we will start our second academic session. And in this session, we have as our speakers Professor Ranjan Panda from the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, IIT Mumbai, Professor Koshy Tharakan, Dean of the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, Goa University, Goa, and Mr. Abhishek Yadav, who is a research scholar in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Bombay, Mumbai. And this session will be chaired by Professor Smita Sarkar. I request the speakers and Professor Sarkar to please come on the stage and commence the session.
Good morning, everyone. With my salutations to Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa Dev, Sharadama, and Swami Vivekananda, let me start this second academic session. And the speakers of this session will be Professor Ranjan Panda, Professor Koshy Tharakan, and Mr. Abhishek Yadav. Without wasting much time, I will also follow the earlier pattern where we will have a question-answer session after each paper, since the papers are so different in their content. So I would request Professor Ranjan Panda. He's a professor of philosophy in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, Mumbai. His areas of research interest are in philosophy of mind and language. He has authored a book titled Mind, Language and Intentionality in 2008 and has edited 2 books. They are Language, Mind and Reality, Reflections on Philosophical Thoughts of R.C. Pradhan in 2015 and Self-Knowledge and Moral Identity in 2023. Currently, he is working on another volume titled Sankhya Yoga, Philosophy of Consciousness, to be published by Springer. So I welcome Ranjan to anything that is convenient. You can be seated and also. Okay, over to you.
I think I will go there, that is better. Okay. Respected Chairperson and my co-panelist, esteemed Swamiji and Professor Nirmalanaran Chakraborty for their kind invitation to this august gathering, and respected all participants present here. The title of my paper is 3 Modes of Conceptualizing the Mental. I will read my paper and I'll have 25 minutes.
Yeah, 25 minutes.
Recently, no one has made a claim concerning consciousness that explicitly, while stating its existence with certainty, and as did René Descartes. His emphatic claim that mind or consciousness exists as an independent substance has been one of the central themes of philosophical discourse since its inception. The mind as a substance is immediately known in the form of self-awareness, as Tonini and Christoph Koch recapitulate it. I quote, "I am conscious here and now is the one fact I am absolutely certain of, all the rest is conjecture." This is, of course, the gist of the most famous deduction in the Western thought, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Everything else, what I think, I know about my body, about the other people, dogs, trees, mountains, and stars, is inferential. It is a reasonable inference corroborated with first by the beliefs of my fellow humans and then by the intersubjective method of science. Yet consciousness itself, the central fact of existence, still demands a rational explanation. The very presence of consciousness expressed in terms of here and now refers to the mindful, conscious experiences. One could derive reasonably one's existence as Descartes did because experience is deeply connected to epistemic engagements in which one intuitively knows about oneself. It is an immediate knowledge, as Lily Allen paraphrases Descartes' thought, I quote, "It is the presence of the actual fact of my thinking and existing that is seen as immediately causing my assent and hence as constituting evidence," unquote. Consciousness necessarily forms the experience of various kinds, including one's own self. Self-consciousness is a kind of experience in which one is being aware of oneself. The demand for a rational explanation becomes a necessity because one's own experience of intuitive awareness of one's existence is considered problematic. Moreover, Descartes' philosophy of mind emerges from his reflection on the nature as a mechanistic system. His radically conceptualization of the metaphysics of mind begins with subjective experiences. As Desmond Clark writes, I quote, "Where the metaphysics is concerned, we begin with such everyday experiences as the experience of thinking, feeling, moving, etc. Among these experiences, Descartes favors the most accessible and widely available experiences because he hopes thereby to find an indubitable foundation," unquote. Consciousness includes all material mental activities, thoughts, sensation, imagination, and experiences. Cogito is indubitable because it is easily accessible to experience. Thinking is an integral part of the mental life of human beings, is one of the basic metaphysical reality in Descartes' philosophy. The nature of understanding consciousness is something unique in comparison to understanding of the nature of the body. While reflecting on this issue and trying to explore further to know about the mind, we need to reflect on the experiential engagement with the world. In this connection, Edmund Husserl's Phenemenology critiques Cartesian dualism, particularly its disengagement with the world, and at the same time emphasizes the experience is an integral aspect of the mind, is intentionally engaged with the world. In the following section, we need to delve into Husserl's theorization of intentionality, which unfolds a descriptive account of understanding a semantic structure of experience. That is, experience being intentionally structured, relate to the subject with the object, and this relation is ontological rather than epistemological. Phenomenology describes the cognitive dimension of consciousness and the nature of experience from the first-person point of view, writes Dan Zahabi. The cognitive dimension refers to the act of knowing and understanding the object vis-a-vis its relationship with the subject. The act of knowing is an intentional act in which the knower is intentionally engaged with the object. The object of experience is an intentional object which is not reduced to the intentionality of subject's experience. It is rather the intentional content that is understood in the intentional structure of experience. As Zahabi explicitly states, the cognitive dimension of consciousness is not in the biological substratum. The naturalistic explanation of the cognitive dimension of experience investigates the neurological basis, whereas phenomenology tries to describe and understand the a priori structure of intentional act. The notion of the intentional act is qualified directedness. For instance, while seeing the bottle on the table, I try to determine the given object of my experience. I try to understand the bottle as something. the core of intentionality, as Zahabi elucidates, consists of interpretation of something as something. This refers to the semantic ability of the subject, which intends something while experiencing the object. The notion of identity of the object is formed in understanding while making the experience prospectival. Thus, the first-person point of view of experience as an object shows a prospectival givenness. However, subjectivity in its epistemic engagement with the world shows that it intentionally interacts with the world, but so far as its ontology is concerned, the Husserlian phenomenology imagines that there is a possibility of conceiving the worldless subject. That is, as Zahabi mentioned, Husserl shows the possibility of living consciousness as it is. Consciousness thereby is not conditioned by the existence of the world. Rather, the first-person intentional subject is the condition of having the objective world. While illustrating this point, Zahabi writes, I quote, "The world can only appear for a subject. Subjectivity does not need the world in order to be. The world, more generally, every type of transcendent, is relative insofar as the condition of its appearances lies outside itself, namely in the subject. In contrast, the subject, the immanence, is absolute and autonomous, with its manifestation only depends on it." Unquote. The subjectivity, which is conceptualized as having an independent existence, is a transcendental subjectivity. Here, the subjectivity, when transcends its intentional relationship with the world, it unfolds its autonomous existence. By saying this, the self and the world relationship is not divided, rather it shows the possibility that there, with transcendental reflection, one can understand the true nature of consciousness in its pure form. Since the notion of intentional experience in phenomenology forms a correlation between mind and the body, or the self and the world, and also uses transcendental reduction or epoche as a new way of experiencing thinking and confirming the primacy of the transcendental subjectivity, it would remain with it without engaging ourselves further in details with the discourse of phenomenology. Here we take a tour to discuss biological naturalism and physicalism, which confirms the primacy of the ontology of the physical as a source of the mental. Biological naturalism, as advocated by Searle, maintains a clear scientific hypothesis that consciousness is caused by brain processes and realized in brain processes. The evolution of life and the brain having the power to cause consciousness and other intrinsic features such as intentionality, subjectivity, phenomenality, etc., is something natural, as principles of mitosis explains the multiple growth of cells. The growth of cells in organism bears an independent function. While describing the function of the brain, Searle refers to the principle of neurophysiological sufficiency. That explains the brain as a complex biological system causally sufficient in delivering consciousness. This is a kind of emergence where the mental life comes out to have its function. For instance, feeling hungry and looking for satisfying hunger shows the experience of hunger connected to a belief state concerning food and the desire to eat and satisfy hunger. The entire process of securing food by adopting alternative means shows the sustainable capacity of the brain. The whole process, commencing from the emergence of the mental states to its culmination in the realization of them, shows there is an interdependency in the relationship between the brain and the mind. This interdependency sustains by both bottom-up and top-down causal relations. The bottom-up causal power lies in the neurological function of the brain. The top-down causal power shows the intentional power of the mind. Searle conceptualizes an explanatory gap between them. The bottom-up causal explanation is about the micro-constituents responsible for causing consciousness. The top-down causal explanation exhibits the performance of intentional action and that are responsible for making institutional facts. Unlike other emergentists, Searle does not advocate the reduction of the mental. Rather, he argues that conscious experiences have a dozen of irreducible properties, including intentionality, subjectivity, etc. Conscious experiences are structured and function independently so far as the explanation of intentional action is concerned. Though Searle considers subjectivity as an objective fact, still this objectivity is only accepted by him as an epistemic condition for explaining the mind. The ontology of mind depends on the neurophysiology of the brain. As there are two theoretical presuppositions of biological naturalism, such as the atomic theory of matter and evolutionary biology, the evolved brain is ultimately linked to micro-level conditions that could be traced from the basic structure of molecules and carbons. The ontology is ultimately physical. Thus, Searle alters the Cartesian dictum, I think, therefore I am, to I exist, therefore I think. Daniel Dennett does support the biological thesis that is responsible for causing mental phenomena. The brain as a biological system produces consciousness or is responsible for having a mental life. According to him, the design and the function of the system of the brain show that there are many interdependent subsystems which work intelligently to produce intelligent behavior. Intentionality and subjectivity, therefore, are systemic features that could be explained in relation to the coordinated function of the subsystems. For instance, to claim that I am thinking or walking are causally explainable as there is no I, no me who has been doing these actions. Moreover, there is a causal process or coordination involved in bringing out all other successive processes which create an impression that there is a unitary power that controls all that internal processes in reality. Internal processes. In reality, the process is carried out by many subsystems that operate parallelly in order to produce a coordinated effect in terms of action or behavior. These functional units are divided while processing the data. There is no central meaner which would act like an inner Cartesian self or the little man in the brain. According to Dennett, only a theory that explains conscious events in terms of unconscious events could explain consciousness at all. Here, the unconscious events are events concerning brain processes. Once this is taken into account, we will overcome the problem of circularity involved in explanation of consciousness. Moreover, using metaphors like software, virtual machine, central mirror, etc., he tries to show how metaphors can deconstruct the Cartesian theory of consciousness in the light of the discovery of brain science. More importantly for him, the Cartesian and the phenomenological method has been unsuccessful in explaining consciousness. For Dennett, the crucial aspect of a complete explanation of consciousness must bring out unconscious neurological process of the organism, that it must be heterophenomenological in its approach. Heterophenomenology explains consciousness from the standpoint of neurophysiology as well as from the angle of interaction with the environment in which organism has developed. Though both Searle and Dennett theorize consciousness from the perspective of evolutionary biology, still Searle differs strongly from Dennett so far the notion of conscious experience is concerned. Searle thinks that intentionality, subjectivity are strictly irreducible features of consciousness, and experiences are reflexive, whereas Dennett has been trying to show that consciousness is causally explained away by considering its physical ontology. One could construe ontology as having many layers so far as Searle's explanation of the mental and social phenomena are concerned. Still, both are committed to naturalistic realism, which shows the mind or the mental per se is conditioned by the physical. The naturalistic program for the explanation of consciousness has been committed to reductionism, as they argue in favor of the thesis that consciousness is a part of the world. According to Thomas Nagel, is a neo-Darwinian enterprise enterprise maintains, I quote, a biological evolutionary account of the nature and origin of those behavioral capacities and function by reference to which consciousness can be analyzed, then provide the final link with more basic physical science, unquote. Consciousness for Nagel is one of the remarkable features of the cosmos. He does not offer a definition but tries to articulate a teleological explanation of conscious life. Teleology presupposes an efficient cause operating all through the stages of biological evolution. Thereby, he conceptualizes a natural teleological law governing the development of organization over time in addition to the law of familiar kind governing the behavior of these elements. However, Nagel mentions that teleological explanation is different from Aristotle's efficient cause that explains the intention of the purposive being, but the consistency of teleological law can be mapped through its function, starting from the fundamental level, which is a source of deriving a rational order in the entire cosmos. If this cosmic rational order is all-pervasive and inherently operating in all beings, it would only exhibit how consciousness has manifested in various forms. I will not go into details of this debate here. Rather, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that teleological mode of understanding the mental cannot rule out the basic idea that intentionality is biological, as Saul claims. Rather, it would extend the realm of the brute facts in nature as a whole and beyond. The rational order would also show how everything functions with a purpose. Looking at the coherent operation of teleological laws, it could be said that at a macro level, this could connect to all forms of existence to the entire cosmos. But that would be more interesting. What would be more interesting is to reflect the teleological operation in the case of performing a basic action that is intended by an individual at a micro level. As Tononi and Koshy are aiming to secure it in order to explain consciousness, consciousness cannot be computed, but it can be built into a structure of the systems. Integrated information theory is formed on the basis of this having an intrinsic existence, composition, information, integration, and exclusion. However, consciousness as an intrinsic existence in human life, which can be inferred from the intent of basic action. In basic action, the ability to do and the knowledge of doing occur simultaneously. They are necessarily connected and intuitively known to the agent. When we make something, for example, making art, the very basic thinking that is intended to make and recognize the process of making it requires a conscious attention. In that sense, the very act of making artwork is an aesthetic performance. It is performed, and the joy of performing is realized in the very mode of thinking and performing. Thus, the performance is self-referential. Moreover, the creative process as an art is completed not just in a creative thinking of the artist, but with the onlookers. But the onlooker completes it, says Nicholas Humphrey in his paper Consciousness as Art. To constitute from the perspective of cogito, thinking is a performance where I intimately engaged in making something here and now. This intentional integration is more explicit in phenomenology rather than in Descartes' cogito or Koshy or Tonini's information integrated theory. While being engaged in making the art, I experience my thoughts having the brush movement of my hands towards the canvas and so on. The intentionality connected to the structure of my experience. While drawing and modifying it repeatedly, my experience keeps unfolding till I see it as intended. This experience is making it perspectival and thus unifies me with the piece of art. And to conclude, naturalistic account, whether biological or teleological, have limitations in conceptualizing the mental. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranjan, for doing so well with time. We have still around 7 minutes. So if I can request very sharp, pointed observations or questions, then we can take more. Yes. We need a microphone to hear you clearly.
It is deliberation. My name is Bhaskar Sen. I am an engineer, mechanical by profession. Do you have any clue? I was just recently going through Hawkins' biography. It seems Hawkins is himself telling that he has in his chair, there is a small computer and there are another gadgetries incorporated by Dell, by which his communication is improved. Do you have any clue on such subjects?
I mean, what do you really mean by saying
What
this?
I was just thinking, Hawkins is a very well-known person.
Yeah.
Now he himself is writing in his biography that by such incorporation of gadgetries by Dell, artificial intelligence or whatever you call it, that's not my subject, and I have not promoted myself to that knowledge level because I am a field operator. I was building projects throughout my life. But this particular statement of Hawkins has intrigued me that yes, possibly, why I am asking is, you have raised all those questions that Descartes has failed, all those Cartesian definition doesn't permit or allow to express kind of a human consciousness, which is an infinite possibility. So this Hawkins statement has made me really wonder.
Consciousness is enhanced with artificial intelligence is possibly acceptable, but consciousness cannot be created by a machine. So I think that is what I would like to stay. Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Hello, Professor. Any Cartesian system going by the name of Descartes, as you revealed in your talk, so any system which is comprising units functioning together to give a desired output, if any one is not functioning properly, that might hamper or hinder the expected output of the system. Is it quite relevant that the dual principality always exists like that in phenomenological observation?
No. Consciousness functions as a one single unit. Yes.
So that might not be hampered even if the system is hampered in the sub-unit, the artificial system.
Logically, when we talk about consciousness, consciousness is a single unit. It represents the self. So yes, biologically, if you are not a normal person, then of course you have difficulties. But to talk about the self as a metaphysical concept, or to talk about consciousness as in the previous presentation by Professor Pradhan, self as a metaphysical or consciousness as a metaphysical concept, or consciousness per se, will not be treated as a discrete element produced by one particular part of the brain or one particular part of a subsystem of a system. Rather, it comes as a kind of a unity, and I think that is also acceptable to both Searle and Cause. So consciousness is not a discrete phenomenon for them. It is a continuously unifying principle. Yes.
Okay. Any other question? Yes. You have to speak a bit loudly.
Are any of these theories testable?
Are any of these theories testable?
Yes, they are testable because, see, even Descartes' theory is also testable, I feel. If you are doing something and you know it, that you are doing, so for you, it is evident, it is so self-evident. It may not be true for others. That's also testable, is not it? But if you want to have testing a theory in the laboratory, the kind of testing which objectify an object as it is, yes, that kind of objectivity is not possible. But the phenomenological insight tells us that the kind of realism, let us say, the observer observing a particular object is the first epistemic condition. Whether the scientist observing, because there was a discussion on quantum mechanics in the last session. So if the scientist is observing a particular object, quantum object, so in that sense we cannot just nullify the presence of the subject. Is not it? So phenomenologically also that is testable. You can, in fact, Husserl is saying that the epoche can be also applicable for the scientist to modify their method of looking at the reality. So epoche has a wider application. So in that sense it is testable. Of course, the other theories are testable as well. I mean, needless to say that.
Yes, we have time for one more question, the last one. Yes, at the back.
So as a layman, I just want to know the stages, say mind and the brain, then mind, and then consciousness and supramental, the evolution of the supramental. So mind, whether it is a part of the brain or consciousness, which is, if it is the part of the brain, it cannot be touched, it can be felt. So what is how do you, these four stages, how do you distinguish and elaborate? Thank you.
Like that, the last quote from Nicholas Humphrey, where he considers consciousness as an art. So he tries to revise, unlike Searle, he tries to revise this, that I feel, therefore I think. So in that sense, when we talk about artistic emotion and the first move to express that emotion in the form of a drawing or any artifact, so that basic move is the most intimately connected with yourself. So and that move is so fundamental that you are not only doing it, but also you recognize that you are making something till it has been made. So that is what you try to locate, how things are conceptualized by your mind or conceptualized in the realm of the mental and expressed to the world. And most of the design art presupposes a designer. Now Humphrey in that essay refers to the biological worldview. He says Darwin also thought of that, the evolution, the process is a great, great source of designing things. But he doesn't limit himself to that stance, because he concludes referring to Nagel and says that consciousness is the center of the spiritual excellence and joy. So the joy and that the experience that a designer derives by designing something is not just a designer's, it's an output that comes out from the designer, but also been complete because there is an onlooker, there is an other who is looking at this fact. Now this other could be you cognizing it, or the audience who is trying to make it complete. There could be two others. The two others is possible when I say I as an other. It's possible when I look at my artifact from a distance, not as just while making it, but simultaneously I am remaking it till it is completed. So both ways it is possible. So there is a transcendental consciousness which is presupposed here, and I think Husserl's phenomenology gives enough insight to understand what it is. So consciousness is not just been connected to the biological brain, but consciousness has its independent existence. Yeah, that is what I would like to sum up to. Yes.
Thank you, Ranjan. Thank you. Yes. May I invite our next speaker, Professor Koshy Tharakan. Koshy Tharakan is currently a professor of philosophy at Goa University. His research interests are in the area of philosophy of human sciences, phenomenology, and comparative philosophy. Koshy has delivered lectures at ISCTE University Institute of Lisbon, Branco de Portugal, HOTA, University of Malta, Mesta, I don't know whether I'm pronouncing it rightly, and Institute of Philosophy, University of Porto, besides many universities in India. Until recently, Koshy was a guest professor at IIT Gandhinagar. His research publications have appeared in various academic journals like the Journal of Indian Council of Philosophical Research, Indian Philosophical Quarterly, Critique, Journal of Human Values, and anthologies published by Universidade Católica Portuguesa, Lisbon, Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, Shimla, National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore, Indian Council of Philosophical Research, New Delhi, and Routledge, London. So may I welcome the speaker to deliver his.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. I will be preferring to sit here and read my paper, following Husserl's insight that the way we constitute the sense of matter is dependent on the way the subject is located. So I think this position enables me to have a better sense of the audience rather than standing at one corner. So for that reason, I would prefer to sit here and read the paper. At the outset, let me thank the organizers of the seminar, the Ramakrishna Mission Institute of Culture, as well as the coordinator of the seminar, Professor Nirmalyo Narayan Chakravarti, for extending an invitation and giving me this opportunity to share some of the ideas of Husserl. I emphasize ideas of Husserl in my own confusions. So let me begin the paper. Husserl's motivation for philosophizing stems from his concern with the incompleteness of knowledge claims made by positive sciences. He thus wishes to supplement our understanding about the world derived from the positive sciences with that of phenomenology. The paper is an attempt to understand Husserl's concept of mind, body, and the notion of consciousness. In Ideas 1, Husserl's discussion of the ego and consciousness emphasizes the notion of pure consciousness, that it has given to certain misgivings about phenomenology as endorsing absolute idealism, particularly in the remarks in Ideas 1, remarks from section 49 to 50, there is this discussion about the annihilation of the world and what remains as the phenomenological residuum as the absolute consciousness. So that's what I'm referring to. And this is one of the reasons why Husserl painstakingly elaborated the position of the body in Ideas 2. And Ideas 2 focuses on the constitution of material nature, the sense of the material nature, as well as the constitution of psychic reality through the body. Lastly, the crisis text brings the realm of the life world in relation to the positive sciences and argues for the need of retaining the first-person intersubjective experiences for an adequate understanding of the worldly phenomena. In his epilogue to Ideas 2, which actually appeared as a prologue to the English translation of Ideas 1, Boyce Gibson translation, Husserl writes, I quote, "It appears to me to be more proper and to be the great task of our time to carry out a radical meditation in order to intentionally explicate the genuine sense of the idea of philosophy. This will come only by means of the systematic elaboration of the method of questioning back into the ultimate conceivable presuppositions of knowledge. This questioning back leads to transcendental subjectivity as the primordial locus of all meaning-giving and validation of being," unquote. So it is this notion of transcendental subjectivity which is dealt extensively in Ideas 1 through what Husserl calls the method of reduction, transcendental reduction, which leads us to the realm of consciousness. According to Husserl, all sciences except phenomenology remains in the natural attitude. Their aim is to recognize the world comprehensively and reliably as it confronts us from the natural standpoint. The greatest impediment to cognition is that, in natural standpoint, the style of research will always be one-sided, as they take for granted the objects or phenomena that appear in our experience. The phenomenological attitude, on the other hand, sets aside all such prevailing habits of thinking. It helps us to develop a method, the method of reduction, by which we are able to transcendentally purify the phenomena that opens the proper direction of regard to every cognition. The general positing, the characteristic of natural attitude, is a consciousness of the object as actually existing. This natural attitude is not an accidental or particular act. Rather, it is a continuous attitude throughout the natural life. One might characterize it as the default attitude. The reduction opens up a true ontological realm of pure or absolute consciousness. Thus, as Levinas points out, from its epistemological starting point, phenomenology reaches to an ontological realm. The reduction operates at two levels, the objective sphere as well as the consciousness sphere simultaneously. Both the object posited and the act of positing is subjected to reduction. Thus, by phenomenological reduction, or epoche or bracketing, the object is bracketed and the act is put out of action. The whole world and its objects posited in the natural attitude ceases to be valid for us. Then, phenomenological reduction is an operation necessary to make pure consciousness and subsequently the whole phenomenological region accessible to us. The term reduction characterizes the turn towards transcendental phenomenology. It provides the conditions of the possibility of empirical knowledge of being as well as the sense of being itself. Husserl talks about three stages of reduction. The first reduction, or phenomenological reduction, effectuates the exclusion of the natural world and the corresponding sciences. Then he also talks about the eidetic reduction, which deals with the material and formal essences that are transcendent. In it, all reference to the particulars are withheld and the essences are brought to light. And also there is what is called the phenomenological reduction, which enables one to understand the meanings through phenomenological reflection. Now, the method of reduction, which is, as Husserl claims, is his actual contribution to philosophy, to arrive at the realm of consciousness, is often misunderstood as a Cartesian kind of skepticism, which Husserl says Husserlian reduction is not actually doubting the existence of the world, but rather just looking at that belief as it is disclosed as a belief. With the transcendental reduction, human beings as persons in association with fellow human beings living in a society are also excluded, as what remains after the reduction is the pure subjectivity, the transcendental ego. The pure subjectivity or ego is something necessarily present in all cogitations. Nevertheless, it is not a part or moment inherent in the mental processes themselves. The pure or transcendental ego is transcendence within immanence. It is the primal region of all being. All other regions of being are rooted in and essentially relative to the region of transcendental pure consciousness. The phenomenological reduction makes a radical ontological distinction, being as consciousness and being as something which becomes manifested in consciousness. The phenomenological method operates in the acts of reflection. Reflection is the ego's living in its mental processes. In other words, I quote Husserl, it is a name of the method of consciousness leading to the cognition of any consciousness whatsoever. In phenomenology, unquote. In phenomenology, reflection itself becomes an object of study, as by reflection we also mean a group of mental processes that are essentially united. Such a reflective analysis reveals the intentional structure of consciousness. I quote Husserl, intentionality is what characterizes consciousness in the pregnant sense and which at the same time justifies designating the whole stream of mental processes as a stream of consciousness and as the unity of one consciousness, unquote. Intentionality, according to Husserl, is the directedness of consciousness which is directed to some object. In other words, consciousness is consciousness of something. The phenomenological analysis of consciousness reveals the noesis noema structure of experience, which again is well known to all of us. Now, from the above discussions, which is there in Ideas 1, we see that the phenomenological reduction that Husserl performed was free from any preconceived notions of earlier philosophical theories about the reality of the world and was aimed at opening up the domain of consciousness by a cultivated mode of reflection. And this, in fact, is what made Husserl to wonder that this emphasis on the availability of the pure realm of consciousness as annulling the reality of the world, that way of interpretation, to set it aright, Husserl comes up with the Ideas 2, wherein he discusses the notion of body in connection with the appearance of things in nature and the manner in which human body appears, in distinction to mere physical bodies, by virtue of the psychical reality it has. In fact, Husserl here makes a distinction between what is known as corpor, the physical body, and Leib, that is the living body or lived body. Husserl's main argument here is that spatial objects can only appear for embodied subjects. As pointed out by Sahavi, Husserl here anticipates the development of a phenomenology of body by Sartre as well as Merleau-Ponty. Of course, in Ideas 2, the body does not directly appear as the focus of his analysis. It is in the course of his analysis of the constitution of material nature that the notion of body figures in the discussion. Without referring to the perceiving body, we cannot grasp fully a material thing, as material bodies depend on the kinesthetic processes of perception by the bodily sense organs. Husserl writes, I quote, to the possibility of experience, there pertains, however, the spontaneity of the course of presenting acts of sensation, which are accompanied by series of kinesthetic sensations and are dependent on them as motivated. Given with the localization of the kinesthetic series in the relevant moving member of the body is the fact that in all perception and perceptual experience, the body is involved as freely moved sense organ, as freely moved totality of sense organs. And hence, there is also given the fact that on this original foundation, all that is thingly real in the surrounding world of the ego has its relation to the body, unquote. For Husserl, the here and now of the body, that is the body as the bearer of the 0 point of orientation, in addition to its being the center of orientation, also has significance to the construction of the spatial world. However, the sense of things in its entirety requires the presence of a plurality of bodies in conversation with each other, where the same system of location given in another subject's viewpoint. This at first seems to be a bit puzzling, as Husserl recognizes, I quote, one might also wonder if we are not entangled here in a circle, for surely the apprehension of one's fellow man presupposes the apprehension of the body and consequently also presupposes thing apprehension, unquote. The solution to this puzzlement is offered by phenomenology by interrogating the apprehension of thing itself as to whether it is an objectively actual thing. Once we entertain this question, we come to see that our description of the constitution of the thing was incomplete, as it was solely with reference to my body orientations. However, as Husserl says, I quote, this subject does not know what others can gaze upon the same world, one that simply appears differently to different subjects. such that the appearances are always relative to their bodies, etc. It is clear that the apprehension of the body plays a special role for the intersubjectivity in which all subjects are investigated objectively as things, unquote. Thus, through intersubjectivity, the object maintains its identity across manifolds of appearances for a multiplicity of subjects. Thus, according to Husserl, objective space is founded on change of location and empathy. As a lived perspective, body does not reveal itself through spatial profiles like any other physical object. Rather, it is a sense of the soul, a term which Husserl reserves for psyche or the mental realm, that which makes the body an animate organism. Husserl's earlier claim that the objectivity of the thing in its full sense requires the embodiment of consciousness is now explained through the sense of the soul. What is meant by the soul is a psychic reality, that dimension where the ego is operationalized through the constitution of the body as animate body. Like the thing, the animate body presents itself as a stable reality that continues through variations in circumstances. However, psychic properties such as aptitudes, character traits, etc., differ from the properties of things in that their sense includes the history of their development. The stability of the psychic stratum is more like that of an historical continuity than that like of a permanent thing. The psychic dimension is experienced as localized in space, but not as extended in space or as a spatially divisible. The psychic reality, thus, is unfragmented, as unlike the thing which is fragmented. Naturalization of consciousness happens with body and soul forming an experiential unity. Husserl writes, I quote, "What we have to oppose to material nature as a second kind of reality is not the soul, but the concrete unity of body and soul, the human or animal subject," unquote. Husserl concludes his exposition of the stratified senses of the animate body by reaffirming the polarity between this uniquely objectified reality and the pure ego, for whom the regions of nature and psyche are constituted senses. Thus, the second section of the book, Idean 2, ends with a distinction between the empirical and transcendental egos. The concluding section of Ideas 2 discusses the region of spirit, a term Husserl uses to refer to the human community and the cultural world, which pervades the whole of the natural world. Here, Husserl describes the full concrete unity of soul and body as person, and he refers to the objective region in which the dimension of person appears as spirit. Earlier in section 2, Husserl had indicated the sense of the region of spirit when he remarked that, I quote, "The form of psychic existence which belongs to the psychic essence and its constitution, just like the spatial form in the parallel case, consists in the form of social community, founded on the form of corporeality, which means much more than materiality, as a community of existence unified by means of the bond of reciprocal understanding," unquote. We have seen that the individual's animate body appears as the referential center of a horizon of natural objects. In the region of spirit, the person, hence as qualified by communal relationships, appears as the focal center of an environing world. This environing or surrounding world is not the objective world of nature, but rather consists of humanized objects and social structures. The appreciation of the sense of the person and the surrounding world of spirit is the subject matter of the human sciences that needs a personalistic attitude as against the naturalistic attitude. The last section, I conclude, life world and the emerging studies on consciousness. According to Husserl, science is a product of human praxis, like any other cultural fact. It is a continuous process that arises within human space through human activity. Science takes shape by way of abstractions and concept formations or idealizations from the pre-scientific life world. The crisis of modern science, according to Husserl, is that it has severed its relation to the life world. I quote Aaron Gurvich, "The crisis of Western science does not concern their technical validity. What is in question is the meaning of the sciences in a philosophical sense, and no less important, their human significance. Science, it seems, has nothing to say as to the things that matter most for human existence," unquote. This scientific attitude, Husserl says, is naturalistic, in which there is a craving for objectivity and universal knowledge. which results in a crisis of the natural sciences. The crisis occurs because the foundational acts by which the object is abstracted from the life world are forgotten in natural sciences. According to Husserl, natural sciences ignore the subjectivity that constitutes the primordial meaning of the objects of scientific inquiry from our pre-theoretical experiences. This way of relegating the pre-theoretical experience or ignoring the constitutive subjectivity is in fact what facilitates the technical success of science. The human sciences, on the other hand, are characterized by what Husserl calls the personal attitude. In personal attitude, our thematic interest is directed toward human beings as persons who are related to the world through their actions. The personal attitude is not generally a theoretical one in the sense it does not seek things in themselves or how they are in objective truth. As Husserl says, it is the particular world with its specific properties that is valid for persons and not the world as it actually is. In supplement 14 to section 3 of Ideen 2, Husserl writes, I quote, "The personal environment is an open one. New persons can always enter our experience. Others can disappear. And finally, there is even nothing preventing Martians from presenting themselves. Hence, according to ideal possibility, we have here infinities. The interest can expand to the universe of the persons who communicate with us and to the corresponding universal surrounding world of things. The explorer penetrates unknown territories and makes them known to us by his descriptions. A special group of sciences, descriptive natural sciences, elaborates at first the purely descriptive expansion of the known horizon. And this description is worked out prior to the intervention of exact physicalist natural science. These sciences describe our human surrounding world, the world of pure things, animals surrounding worlds, and in anthropological surrounding world. Hence, they arise out of a personalistic attitude. They can also serve as preliminary stage for natural sciences, for the objective sciences, unquote. According to Anthony Steinbock, the supplementary text obliterates the gulf between the life world and the scientific world, as Husserl allowed the possibility that our concept of the life world gets expanded and merges with the scientific world. I quote Steinbock, "The very contrast that Husserl belabored, namely the one between the life world and the scientific world, between concrete and objective accomplishments, becomes sedimented, presupposed, and habitual. The life world itself integrates scientific truths and becomes expanded." Such a reading, unquote, such a reading of Husserl then points to the possibility of Husserlian phenomenology being combined with neurosciences to unravel the phenomenon of consciousness. Thus, Woodruff Smith points out, I quote, "What we need today to understand the phenomena of consciousness, much discussed in recent philosophy of mind oriented to cognitive neuroscience, is a more systematic phenomenology framing a careful analysis of structures of subjective experience," unquote. This particular rendition of Husserlian phenomenology seems to jive with the proposal that Nagel makes regarding developing a conception of subjective points of view having objective physical characteristics. I conclude with this possibility of developing a phenomenologically informed science, which, is a this is in another article, Nagel says this as conceiving the impossible, to construe the possibility of constructing a science, an objective science of the subjective. That's a challenge for any emerging studies on consciousness. Thank you.
Thank you for doing so well with time. So we have around 10 minutes for the question-answer session. And as again, please be brief and pointed. Yes.
Is a cognition of nullness possible?
Cognition of?
Is a cognition of nullness?
Nothingness, nullness.
Is a cognition of nullness possible? If yes, what is its object? If no, what does zero represent?
See, the object that Husserl talks about, one should understand within the realm of the phenomenological epoche, where you have taken the transcendence into the immanence. So the object will be, technically speaking, noema, the object as intended. So nullness as intended is the is the object for phenomenological analysis. Now, many things which we intend may not exist in reality. There are imagined, for example, square circle. Husserl gives this example of imagining something like a square circle. There I think Husserl follows the Meinongian kind of logic that even to make a judgment about such notions of square circle, etc., you need to have some sort of a noema about that. Then only you can deny its impossibility. But that doesn't mean in the actual world there are square circles. So similarly, one could handle this problem of talking about nullness.
Sir, as you said, spatial objects may appear for embodied subjects. So if a spatial object is an inanimate one, would there be any kinesthetic aspect associated with it?
If the spatial objects are inanimate?
Inanimate one, then how would you evaluate the kinesthetic associated with it?
No, Husserl is talking about a lived body here. As I told you, he makes a distinction between physical body, which mere things like this bottle or something, which is corpor, and lab. This constituting is the lab, this function here, the lived body.
Yes, can we have the microphone here? Yes, Professor Menon.
Well, it's not a question. Actually, it's an engagement with a question which I heard from behind and then perhaps raising it too. I guess the difference between nullness and zero is that zero is a value and nullness has no value. So how are the cognitions different? And cognition itself, is it an enterprise which has a value? That's something which we have to ask. And perhaps from there we can explore whether the cognition of nullness and cognition of zero are phenomenologically different as well as technically different as well. Because the whole idea of nullness, perhaps if we extrapolate to emptiness or inclusiveness or infinitude, that is something completely different from cognizing a particular value, such as zero. Is that okay?
Yes, I guess it was just a follow-up response to his question.
Thanks for that.
Yeah, we have
but
another.
the idea that I was trying to convey through the phenomenology was the notion of noema. That even for nullness, perhaps you need to have a noema about it. What is it that consciousness is intending about nullness? Otherwise, it's silence. You are not articulating that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Tharakan, for this deep paper. Now, in terms of body, the lived body, understanding the lived body in its social phenomenological context also brings us to the notion of a collective body, collaborative body. It is in that sense, what is the possible line of dialogue between Husserl and Spinoza? So far, very little conversation with Spinoza in terms of naturalism. And my second quick query is that Husserl talks about a modality of perception called aperceptive perception, where the far is near, and Jayan Mohanty has built quite creatively on that. Now, what is the implication of an aperceptive perception in reconceptualizing body, so that the body also can feel the far as near? And my final query in terms of crisis of science, the crisis of science is also related to crisis of colonialism. So in terms of the colonization of the life world, what Husserl has to speak about it in terms of your very, forward-looking, project about constructing a phenomenologically induced science also requires a foundational critique of colonization in its multiple processes.
Thank you. These are all very lauded questions which goes beyond my ability to respond immediately. Spinoza, with regard to the first question, Spinoza, frankly speaking, I have not thought about along that lines until now. Except, in some of the interpretations of Husserl's, commentators like Smith, for example, David Woodruff Smith mentions that one can understand Husserlian, philosophy of mind somewhat like monistic, but it's aspect monism, as he calls it. It's one substrate having different aspects, because Husserl, also incorporates this Aristotelian notion of, parts and moments, aspects when he talks about of bodies. So a moment is something for Husserl which cannot be separated from the whole. It's a dependent part. So both, what may be called the matter as well as the mental, the psyche, can be construed in Husserlian phenomenology as two aspects of the one substrate, ontologically speaking, and that's how Smith interprets it. But beyond that, I'm not quite familiar with the Spinozistic interpretation. But the third was crisis colonial. Yeah, it's true. Modern science, the way it is. The title of Husserl's book itself is called "Crisis of European, Sciences." That's the title: "Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology." So Husserl recognizes that kind of, objectification of the physical world, which the modern science has undertaken. And as someone here in the earlier discussion was pointing out, science also has surpassed that. At least in the recent developments in quantum physics and all. So in that sense, the correction that Husserl is trying to bring in is to remind us that when we talk about any object, whether it is natural, scientific, or what the sciences deal with, we cannot ignore the constituting subjectivity. So any science which see, there is another section in as a supplement text where Husserl talks about bringing the natural sciences into the domain of human sciences. There is a section in Ideas 2 where he says the need is that we need to bring such estranged, objectified sciences to the domain of the human sciences, which takes the personalistic attitude as against the natural attitudes. And what was the second question I missed? That you mentioned something about Mohanty also, I remember. Okay. Yeah. How it... the location. Okay. Right now, I have no response to that. I had to think about it.
I guess we can take it up
Yeah.
after the session. Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Tharakan. May I request our third and final speaker of this session. Abhishek Yadav is a doctoral researcher in philosophy at IIT Bombay. So we look forward to hear an upcoming young scholar of philosophy. Yes, the floor is open.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abhishek, and I am a researcher scholar at the Department of HSS, IIT Bombay. And the title of my presentation is A Limited Critique of Heterophenomenology. So, before I begin with my presentation, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present my paper here. So in my presentation, I would be talking about three things. One, what is heterophenomenology? Second, why is my critique a limited critique? And third, what is the critique? So to begin with, this term heterophenomenology is introduced and proposed by Daniel Dennett first in 1982 in his paper How to Study Human Consciousness Empirically or Nothing Comes to Mind. Then he furthers this argument in subsequent years in 1991 and 2003, and then later the most recent justification that he provides was in 2007. And he claims that it's a method to study consciousness from a third person point of view, but it does not claim anything what consciousness may or may not be. Now, the origin of the word, as Dennett describes, is that heterophenomenology is a method as opposed to autophenomenology. So it's a study of phenomena of others. And the reason why Dennett thinks that this method is needed, because phenomenology is necessarily tied up with the first person or the subjective point of view. And as long as we have tied consciousness with the subjectivity or the first person point of view, we cannot avail ourselves with the scientific world or the discoveries of the scientific world. So the aim of the method, according to Dennett, is to free the study of consciousness from the first person subjective point of view and bring it in the domain of the third person objective point of view. So as he has emphasized and throughout his writings, that his ultimate aim is to bridge the gap between the manifest and the scientific image of the world. So this method of heterophenomenology is one of the important and significant step, according to him, to bridge this gap. So he considers heterophenomenology to be the bridge between the subjectivity of human consciousness and the natural sciences. Now, the features of heterophenomenology that Dennett claims and how it makes it a good method. So he says that it's not a new method that he's proposing, but he is devising this method or redefining this method with set of principles and constraints, and these constraints would help this method to be used in the study of consciousness from the third person point of view. And the hallmark or the most important feature of this method is its metaphysical minimalism. As I said in the beginning, that it does not presuppose what consciousness is. It presumes nothing about what consciousness may turn out to be or even where it may be found, and nothing about what is that one is conscious of. So now he says that since it does not presume where it can be found, so how do we start the inquiry? And he says that the inquiry should be started with normal human beings, and the reason for doing so is because we tell each other in different ways, not explicitly outrightly that I'm conscious, but in different ways we express that we are conscious. So the subject of the inquiry would be normal human beings, and the aspect that since we express that we are conscious, hence the saying part becomes the most important part in his method of heterophenomenology. So, and the other feature of heterophenomenology that Dennett emphasizes is that it's an unavoidable outcome if someone wants to rely on objective sciences or natural sciences. So any position that acknowledges the fallibility of first person account and relies that the third person methods can explain more than the first person subjective account would ultimately turn out to be a heterophenomenological approach. Now, what is this method? So since we have placed it in context, then the method that Dennett describes, Dennett takes it to be a two-step method, and I have broken down it into three for better explanation. The first and second, Dennett takes it together. So the first step of the method is recording the verbal noise and its transcription. Second, purifying the text, that includes revisions and clarification. And the third step is interpreting the text following the interpretation of theorist fiction and by taking an intentional stance. Now, in the first step, we record whatever the subject says his or her experience, conscious phenomenal experience is, and then we create a transcript of that. Now, why transcript is necessary is because, according to Dennett, that this, when we transcribe something, it has a regularity, it has it provides an abstraction from acoustic properties, and it's reliably more objective and refined as compared to verbal data. Of course, when we say that it provides us with an abstraction from acoustic and physical properties, it does not mean that words don't have physical properties, but his emphasis is that it's reliably more objective. Now, the second step that, as I said, that he takes these two steps together, I'm breaking it into two. Purifying the text. So in the process of purifying, inaudible and inarticulate words are predicted in accordance with the given rules of grammar, and subjects manifest intentions. And here intention refers to grammatical and lexical intentions. So an example of this could be that when we are transcribing someone's verbal report, we will include some articles that are missing in the verbal speech. Or if someone said left to light, we would correct it to left to right, because why would someone say left to light? So these kinds of changes we can do. And then, even then, whatever remains unclear or what he considers can be matters of judgments, they can be marked and isolated, and if need be, can be discarded as data. Now, in this process of revision, a heterophenomenologist, the one who is performing this or recording this data, can ask subjects as many questions to revise and refine the text. And subjects on their own can also suggest any revisions on their own. Now, this purified text or report that we have consists of speech acts and assertions and not mere pronunciations. And the text is a result of the process that has intentional interpretation. Now, here, before I go further, there is a point that many people have objected to in Dennett's this theorization, that if it is a result of a process that has intentional interpretation, and we said in the beginning of the method that we are not presuming what consciousness may be and where it can be found, and when we are talking about intentional interpretation, we say that only conscious subjects have beliefs. So how is it? Is it not contradicting the first principle? And Dennett's reply is that by considering the example that if you believe in the possibility of philosophical zombies, then this breaks the necessary connection between intentional interpretation and consciousness, and he maintains that. He considers intentionality to be a substrate neutral phenomena. So this intentional interpretation helps us in excluding the certain statements by experimental design. And what he means by this is that when we analyze the text and when we are recording the text, we want to hear what the subject actually believes, not what subject hopes or hopes that we want to hear. So that those are the kind of things when we clarify to subject that he has to express what he actually believes. So we are so that we can interpret the text as what he wished to affirm or express. Now this report, now this is a point where many people have criticized to Dennett's method, that this report would constitute the subject's heterophenomenological word. And this serves as the primary data for a heterophenomenologist to work upon. Now, it's not the report of the heterophenomenological word, but this report is the data. And this is a point that Dennett has emphasized at many places. Now, the third step that comes is interpreting the text. And to interpret this text, Dennett draws an analogy from the interpretation of fiction. And this is the point I wish to criticize here. So, and that gives the answer that why is it a limited critique. So I'm not, in this paper, although I have attempted somewhere else, I'm not attempting to criticize the efficacy of heterophenomenology as a solution to bridge the gap between the manifest and the scientific image of the world. For the purpose of this paper, I am considering that it may turn out to be true, nor am I attempting to question whether such a purified text can be generated. What I am attempting to criticize is the basis of the third step, that is interpretation of the text on the basis of interpretation of a novelist fiction. Now, the analogy between interpreting a fiction and interpreting a heterophenomenological text report serves as the foundation for the final outcome of the method. So, though Dennett has discussed novelist fiction in some detail in his 1991 work, but the detailed justification of the same remains in the first paper. And so this leaves open, since I'm calling it a limited critique, so it leaves open that if there can be another alternative way that Dennett can provide in which the heterophenomenological report can be interpreted, this objection wouldn't apply. So there have been many criticisms that has been raised against Dennett's method of heterophenomenology, and I briefly mention some of the important ones. So Levine posited an objection to the fact that a catalogue of beliefs about experience is not the same as the catalogue itself. And to respond to that, Dennett again emphasized that report is the data, not of the data. Then another criticism was raised by Goldman, where he highlighted that Dennett is mistaken in considering that the method of heterophenomenology is already a standard method to study consciousness. Zahavi criticizes Dennett's proposal of heterophenomenology being an alternative to phenomenology on account of Dennett's interpretation of phenomenology and of phenomenological tradition. So according to Zahavi, Dennett could not, or Dennett did not understand Husserl's phenomenology. And there have been other. So I come to this. Switzgabel has posited objections to Dennett's analogy with interpretation to fiction, which is what I'm attempting here. But his objection focuses on the point that when a subject expresses belief about his phenomenology, he is not creating fiction, and treating it as a fiction is a mistake. And what I am attempting here is I'm leaving open that possibility that even, let's consider for the sake of the argument that we can create such a report. So now, as I said, the third step in the method of heterophenomenology is the interpretation of the text. And this task, according to Dennett, is similar to interpreting a novelist fiction. And Dennett gives out the details of how this is to be achieved, and by giving an analogy of how we interpret fiction. And the beliefs contained in, as I said, report should be treated as the fiction. And as I said, that this is what Switzgabel had criticized. Now, why Dennett, before I go on to present my criticism, why Dennett wants to bring this analogy to interpret this report? Because according to him, this gives us two advantages. One is possibility of the postponement of the question about the relation between the entities and events in fiction and events and entities in the real world. So if we treat it as fiction, we don't have to look for the reference of certain words in heterophenomenological report out in the real world. And second advantage that it provides, a detailed description of the narrator can be prepared without fixing the reference of the narrator, but only by creating a logical construct as a referent. And this allows, in case of heterophenomenological text, that I and we may not refer to any subject per se. So what he means by that sometimes in novels or some works of fiction where I as a narrator is, and the narrator of the story is it's written in autobiographical mode and the narrator is I, so we can talk about the narrator of the fiction without having to worry about whether the narrator is the author itself or some logical construct given in the fiction. So these are the advantages, according to Dennett, of bringing this analogy. So he considers these novels and stories and goes on to say that they often are or are taken to be fiction, yet we are able to interpret them. Them being fiction does not stand in the way of their interpretation, rather frees the interpretation from certain distractions such as truth, reference, and sincerity. And it also allows dismissal of certain questions outrightly and opens the possibility of postponement of others, as I discussed some of these. Even though we are aware or take the story to be not true, we can still talk about what is true in the story. So Sherlock Holmes lived in Baker Street, so we can talk about that it's a truth in the story even though the story is not true. And then it goes on to claim these two more features about interpreting the fiction, that there can be more truths in the story than explicitly asserted in the story. And that's a quote, that what is true in the story is much, much more than what is explicitly asserted in the text, of course. And other than that, the second one is that other than true and false, there can be so many indeterminate facts in a given story. And I'm attempting to criticize P1. And the implications that Dennett draws from these features features of interpreting novelist fiction is that it informs us indirectly about the novel or the story, the writer and the point of the story from the world portrayed in the novel. By observing caution about the judgments of taste or preference, we can learn a lot of unchallengeable objective facts about the described world. And the third, that one can know about a fictional world without the knowledge of the text. And again, I quote here because this C3 is important, that knowledge of the world portrayed by a novel can be independent of knowledge of the text of the novel. Now, coming to my objection, that even if we consider, for the sake of the argument, that Dennett is correct and it is truly possible to prepare a heterophenomenological report of the kind Dennett proposes by meticulously following every step as described by Dennett. So the heterophenomenologist has recorded the text and followed the second step and has purified it as per the best of the ability of the subject. And let's consider that this is the heterophenomenological world of the subject. There still remains the problem of interpretation. Now coming back to the point which I said I'm attempting to criticize, he claims that what is true in the story is much, much more than what is explicitly asserted in the text. And then it takes an example of one such truth, that there are no jet planes in Holmes, London. And then goes on to say that this is not asserted explicitly or even logically implied. And this is where I'm raising my problem. I claim that even though P1 is true, it is true only for the logically implied truths that can be deduced from the explicit claims in the text. Every other claim or question will fall under indeterminate category. So what this means is that if it's not logically implied in the text that is explicitly asserted, we cannot claim that to be true. So how do we know that it's true that there are no jet planes in Holmes, London, as Dennett claims? So I draw a comparison with another example that I consider that it's not same as claiming that it is true that Sherlock Holmes is taller than John Watson. So if we had given these explicit statements like Sherlock Holmes is 6 feet tall or John Watson is 5 feet 6 inches tall, so we can deduce that Sherlock Holmes is taller than John Watson. But now, there are no jet planes in Holmes, London. When we come to that, what if we see BBC miniseries Sherlock? There are jet planes in Sherlock's Holmes, London. Now, one may point out that BBC miniseries is not the same fiction as the one Dennett is talking about, but this can be answered by Dennett's implication himself. Yes, in 5 minutes. So, knowledge of the world portrayed by a novel can be independent of knowledge of the text of the novel. And this was justified by Dennett using an example of another TV series, that to considers an example of Madame Bovary and claims that even though he has never read the text, but since he has seen the BBC TV series on this Madame Bovary, he knows what happens in the world. And this is the main objection that I'm trying to raise. So what comes from this is that other than, as I said earlier, that other than the logically implied truths, every other information is indeterminate. And even though Dennett recognizes an indeterminate area in P2, as I had said, that he claims that other than true and false, there are facts which cannot be determined. But what this set of indeterminate truths that is neither explicitly asserted or logically implied is left unclear. So my suggestion is that every fact other than what is explicitly asserted or what can be logically implied in the text would lie in this indeterminate set. Now, this implication of this objection to Dennett's analysis is that it restores the authority of what is true and false in the fiction with the author. However, this restoration creates a further issue with Dennett's thesis, because usurping or limiting the author's authority is one of the important aspects that Dennett attempts to bring in interpreting the heterophenomenological text. That is to say that from an objective science, you can claim something that even though the subject is saying this is not what I felt. So I'll conclude. So heterophenomenology, as I said, that is proposed in an alternative and as a method of study consciousness. And this method, I explained the 3 steps, that recording the report, purifying the report, and then interpreting the report. And even though this method has been criticized, I attempt to criticize just one aspect of interpretation, and I claim that since I'm presenting it as a limited critique, because if Dennett can develop or propose another method to interpret this fiction or this heterophenomenological report, the method would be fine. So the objection that is raised here is focused on the analogy that Dennett attempts to make between the interpretation of fiction and the interpretation of this heterophenomenological report. And I'm saying that what Dennett deduces from interpretation of fiction is not correct, and there are some inconsistencies that one can highlight. And so hence the interpretation step so proposed by Dennett in his heterophenomenological method cannot be the method to interpret the heterophenomenological report, because it cannot even be used in interpretation of the fiction itself. And that is all. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhishek. We have time for quick 2 to 3 questions, but please keep it short. Thank you for a lucid presentation.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, Professor Menon. Oh, no, I guess we can start with you.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. So my question would carry perhaps naivete, because I've not studied the topic which you perhaps have studied in depth. How do you bring heterophenomenology for cross-cultural dialogues? Because we have to remember that we live a culture which is perhaps different, which is good, and we talk about a certain sense of plurality in our life worlds. So how would a method like heterophenomenology can be placed in a country like India, or if you take South Asia in large, which also can boast of an antiquity in its way of living? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your question. So how Dennett would respond, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, that he focuses on this verbal speech, and then he goes on to create a transcript of the same. So his how he would deal with if this question is posited to Dennett about how multicultural or transcultural dialogue can be accommodated, he would be that whatever language the subject is speaking, and he would make a record of that without taking care or without bothering about, I would say, the difference in the cultural practices. For him, it would just be the textual report or the verbal report that one can create. And that is why, as I said, there has been different sorts of criticism for Dennett's approach. And I here focused on the interpretation part. So for this purpose of my paper, I have already taken that whatever Dennett is saying in the first and the second step is true. Okay, it's possible. But even then, it would fail in the third step.
Yeah, thank you. And I think we can continue this conversation.
Yes, thank you.
One last
but maybe I'll just continue. I mean, half a comment of it. So when we talk about consciousness,
yes,
if we follow such methods, which will take away the cultural richness and the plurality of many colors how do we bring in contemporaneity? Because today we are exposed to diaspora and communities who vehemently argue for representing plurality, and any discussion on consciousness have to include one who is in the margin as well, and especially if that language is not part of a mainstream, roadshow. Thank you. We can discuss
if I
later.
can just
Yeah,
a
sure.
brief response is that Dennett brings in an element what he calls memes, and taking it in the sense of how it was introduced by Richard Dawkins, where it's an independent parasite that goes on from one brain to another brain, and he says that all these cultural phenomena will be taken care of his theory of memes. So we can discuss this later. Thank you, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, Professor.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, she reminds me of the famous paper of J. Van Brakel, No Need for a Shared Language. Do you believe in some common human form of living? Actually, you have to interpret the other culture, other languages, and there is no common form of living, pluralists say. But there is a common form of living, Brakel says, and also you can say, I can say Amartya Sen, our culture, their culture. Do you support that?
I would, but Dennett wouldn't. And for Dennett, it would be treating like interpreting different kinds of fiction. Rather than like fiction being one category, it would be different kinds of fiction and their interpretation.
Yes, I think this would be the last question because we have a live session. You can carry on the question after the session, please. So I would like to thank all the three speakers, and thank you, Abhishek.
Thank you, ma'am.
We conclude this session. Thank you.